Welcome to my presentation this afternoon, which is entitled Strategy, the Crucial Enabler. Now, as you can probably guess already from my accent, I'm not from round these parts. Can anyone guess where I'm from? It's not New York. No, I'm from England, and the reason I say this is I think it was Winston Churchill that once said that the US and the UK, they're two cultures separated by a common language. And who's been to the UK here? Yeah, you can probably attest to that. We have different words for things. So if I do say anything that you don't understand, then please let me know. If I'm using any of my sort of weird British English, please do say. My presentation today is going to talk about strategy and why it's important for us as business analysts. And I don't know about you, but I've found in my work as a business analyst that often the word strategic and strategy, it's abused. And it's almost become much maligned in organisations. And we get two lenses sometimes that we look at strategy through. Sometimes people use the word strategic to make something sound more important. Has anyone had that? Where someone presents a plan, but they call it a strategic plan. But there's nothing at all strategic about it. And the other lens is we get sort of strategic ivory towers, where strategy is created, but it's never really distributed, and it's sort of detached from everything that we do as business analysts or the organisation does. So we're going to talk about how to avoid these things, the sort of things we can do as business analysts to interact with strategy, to get to know strategy, and so forth. Please do feel free to tweet throughout the presentation. My Twitter handle is UK Adrian Reed. The conference hashtag, as you're probably aware, is BBCCon, so do tag me on anything you tweet. If you want to take photos, feel free to type and take photos as you wish. So my presentation this afternoon has two main parts. I'm going to start by talking about why strategy is so important in organisations. I mean, I'm pretty sure we're probably already bought into that, but I'm going to use a bit of a case study. It's a case study you will have heard of before, but we'll be looking at it from a slightly different angle this time. I'm then going to move on to talk about what strategy is. I'm going to share a definition with you that I particularly like. You know, there are a lot of definitions out there, but there's one that I'll share with you. And then I'll talk about some techniques we can use as business analysts to engage with strategy. It will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, that part of the presentation. But if there's any technique that you want to know more about, catch up with me afterwards. I can post you links or recommended reading and so forth. If you're an experienced BA, you may well have seen some of these things before, or all of them before, but it's always a useful refresher, and we may be looking at them from a different angle. So I want to start by sort of asking the question why strategy is so important. And in order to do that, I want to transport you back in time to April the 15th, 1912. Because on April the 15th, 1912, early in the morning, in the North Atlantic Ocean, about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, something of historic proportions was about to occur. What was about to occur? Yeah, the sinking of the Titanic, right? Yeah, so it's kind of entered our collective culture through myth and mystery and folklore. Why did the Titanic sink? It hit an iceberg, right? Yeah, it hit an iceberg. But what if I told you that the root cause, or some of the root causes of the Titanic sinking, certainly the iceberg finally sank it, but actually the Titanic was sort of doomed to fail before it even left the shipyard. And that failure was built in before the blueprints ever left the design engineer's office. And that part of this was this clash of worldviews. Because on the one hand, the Titanic was designed to be the safest ship that had ever sailed. There was a premium put on safety. But on the other hand, there was this need for luxury. There were going to be millionaires on board. And because those two diametrically opposed strategic views were never really reconciled, you ended up with something that was sold as very safe, but actually really, really wasn't. You see, it turns out that there were a whole bunch of design compromises made before the blueprints ever left the design engineer's office. Now, we're probably all aware, if you've seen the film or if you've even heard or read about the Titanic, that one of the ways it was made unsinkable was the hull was segmented into 16 different compartments. And these 16 different compartments had watertight bulkheads. The idea being that if the hull was ever breached, the water would be contained. And it was actually designed so that up to 4 of those compartments could flood and the thing would stay afloat. That was the safety element. But you see, there were going to be millionaires on board. And, I mean, $1 million is a lot of money now, right? But back in 1912, can you imagine how much money $1 million would be? And these were people that expected luxury and opulence like we can probably only imagine. And one of the things they needed was a long, luxurious ballroom. And this long, luxurious ballroom spanned several segments, several bulkheads. What that meant was that first line of defense against flooding was nibbled away because a whole bunch of these compartments, the bulkheads, didn't reach the top of the ship. So when the water flooded in, it could skip between departments and create weight to take the ship down. Not only that, it appears when you look at some of the historic papers about the Titanic that there was some kind of pressure on cost. Now, this was back in the day where manufacturing of ships was very, very manual. Every single rivet, I found this fascinating, every single rivet on the Titanic was made of iron and it was handmade. The main shipbuilder that was commissioned to do it couldn't get enough skilled labour to do it. They outsourced it. Now, modern chemical analysis on some of those rivets has shown that they were made of really, really poor quality iron. The chemical concoction that was used was impure, had the wrong balance and so forth. And the thing about bad quality iron, it turns out, is that it's very brittle. And if something's brittle, if you hit it hard, it shatters. So you've now got this situation where the bulkheads don't go up to the top of the ship and the rivets holding key bits of the ships together are going to shatter if they're hit. So, cost versus that other strategic imperative of safety. Also, when you read some accounts of the Titanic, it's been theorised, this is more difficult to prove, it's been theorised that there was a huge pressure for on-time arrival. This was the maiden voyage of the Titanic. It was going from Southampton in the UK through to New York. It's reported that the ship was being steamed at 22 knots through the ice field, which is considered incredibly fast for treacherous waters at that point in history. Not only that, the captain actually cancelled the lifeboat practice and the lifeboat drills to get off from Southampton quicker, presumably because he thought he could rely on the safety of the ship. But also there was this pressure for time. So you've got these competing worldviews. Is it about safety, luxury? Is it about time? Is it about cost? But for me, most interesting of all is it turns out the Titanic had one of the most sophisticated radio systems of its era on board. It was operated by the Marconi radio company. And the Titanic was able to hear, respond to, and relay messages from ships in the local area by way of telegraphy. And in the lead-up to the tragic events of the Titanic sinking, it received no fewer than 6 warning messages telling it that there was ice in the area. The trouble was, the people operating the telegraph weren't employed by the White Star Line that operated the Titanic. They were employed by Marconi, the radio operator. And Marconi made its money not so much by getting the operational traffic to the captain, but by relaying commercial telegraphs. Remember, you got millionaires on board this ship, and it turns out a hobby of millionaires at that point in time when you're on a cruise was to send nice little telegrams to your friends and family back home, telling them about how much you're enjoying the buffet or whatever they were having on board. The cruel irony is the last message that was received by the Titanic just a few hours before it sank gave specific coordinates of the ice field. It warned of icebergs. Titanic responded with, shut up, you're jamming me," because they were trying to get these commercial signals through. Now this suggests there were almost different implied missions for the Titanic. You know, what was the Titanic actually for? Was it for safe carriage of passengers? Was it for making money for its operators? Was it for something else? Or was it some compromise between those things? But without reconciling those visions, those missions, those worldviews, it kind of pulled itself apart. Ironically, we could argue it was doomed to fail before it even left the shipyard. And without that common view, without that underlying cohesion of vision, mission, we find ourselves in organisations where at every possible decision it's like a roadblock. There's no guiding vision, there's nothing to guide us. Every decision becomes really effortful. And in organisations, we then face our own organisational icebergs. Things that come and hit us from left field that may have been, ironically, predictable. And I know what you're probably thinking now. You're thinking, well, that's an interesting piece of history, Adrian, but we don't work on ships. And we certainly don't work on the Titanic. Although actually I'm looking at seeing the smiles. Maybe a few of you feel like you're working on a project that's feeling like the Titanic, right? Yeah, we've all been there. But I bet every single one of us has worked on a project where we've been asked to make some design compromises. Am I right? Yeah. Has anyone ever worked on a project where there's been a pressure on cost? All of us. Pressure for on-time arrival to deliver on time? Yeah, absolutely. And we may even have worked on some projects where we've warned of issues or risks, and those warnings have been ignored. So perhaps some of these patterns occur in an organisational environment as well. And perhaps it's down to that underlying cohesion, that strategy. So if that's why, or one example of why a strategy is so important, I wanted to move on to talk about what strategy is and how we might play with it as business analysts. And a definition of strategy that I really like. I mean, there are lots of definitions out there. There's a great definition from Michael Porter about competitive strategy. But a definition I really like of strategy is from a 2011 book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. If you haven't read it, it's one that's worth putting on your reading list. It's an excellent book. And the author, Rummelt, describes strategy as a cohesive response to an important challenge. And in organisations, we could almost rehash that to say it's a cohesive response to some kind of opportunity or threat out there in our business environment. He goes on to say that unlike a standalone decision or goal, a strategy is a coherent set of analyses, concepts, policies, arguments, and actions that respond to a high-stakes challenge. And for me, one of the most important words in there is that coherence, it's that cohesiveness. Think about the tragedy of the Titanic. It was pulling itself apart because there was no clear goal. It's about that cohesiveness. Now, in organisations, if there isn't that cohesiveness, it doesn't have to be such a catastrophic failure as the Titanic. In organisations, these things manifest themselves in like little tiny ways that might seem insignificant individually, but as a whole can actually affect an organisation and how it operates. I'll give you an example. In my day job, I do training and consulting for clients. I was recently facilitating a workshop for a client, and it was one of those typical situations where I got time in the stakeholders' diaries, but the thing the organisation didn't have is a room to put the people in. You know, if you can get the time in people's diaries, you can't get a room. So I did what I guess most of us would do in that circumstance, and I hired a meeting room for a local hotel. There's a very major hotel chain. It's one that, if you looked at their vision and mission statement, is very much about providing excellent customer service. Okay, I won't tell you which brand it is. It's one you would recognise, though. It's a global brand that's known for its customer service. And I booked the meeting room for 2 days. We were going to have quite a controversial and confidential meeting about some strategic stuff. And I rocked up early on the first day, about 7:45. I kind of bounded up to the reception because I'm quite an energetic person, as you may or may not have picked up on. I'd had my coffee, and I rocked up to the reception desk, and I was met by the most enthusiastic receptionist I've ever met in my life. She greeted me with such a warm welcome, which incidentally is quite unusual in the UK. We're quite understated, yeah. So normally you just sort of just get a growl. No, I jest. And anyway, she was great. She said, "Okay, Adrian, so you've got the meeting room for 2 days." She showed me to the meeting room. She made sure all of my AV kit would work, the projector. She got flip charts around, and I said, "Okay, look, just one final question. Can I keep the key to the meeting room? Because we're going to be discussing some controversial and some confidential stuff. I really don't want anyone walking in off the street. I'm here for 2 days. Can I just keep it?" And she was like, "Adrian, seriously, it's fine. All we ask is that when you come back tomorrow, just check in at reception so that we know you're here." Okay, great. So we have our first day. I'm facilitating. It's an exhausting day. I'm there till about 7 p.m. I do some write-up afterwards. I leave, go back to my hotel room, crash out. I'm up even earlier the next morning to set up, ideas buzzing around my mind, go to reception, and I'm expecting the same receptionist to be there, but unfortunately I was met with somewhat of a different welcome. Anyone ever met that receptionist? Yeah, there was a very strong yes from here, so okay. And the first thing that happened was I got to the reception desk and the phone rang and she took the call. So, well, okay, fine. I mean, I am here, but, you know, the phone's there too, so okay. Anyway, so I explained, I'm back. I'm here for a second day. I've already got the key. And the look on her face. "What do you mean you've already got the key?" So I explained, "Well, I got the room for 2... No. You're not allowed to keep the key. In fact, we noticed the key was missing last night, and we have a list. We have a list of people who try and steal our keys, and your name is now on that list, and if you ever come back to this hotel, you won't be trusted with the key at all." They seriously have a list. So anyway, I did what most British people would do in that situation, which was apologise, because that's what we do. And the passive aggressiveness was building up in me, which is another British trait for those of you that have been there. So I looked disapprovingly and kind of tutted. But anyway, but it's interesting, right? Because I can't remember. You can't always remember what somebody says to you, but you sure as hell can remember how they make you feel. And I can remember how she made me feel. But I don't blame that receptionist. You know, you think about why she was acting in that way. It is probably a middle manager had perceived a problem with a lack of keys, and he tried to solve that problem by creating this key list, or delinquent list, or whatever it was going to be called. And he was probably measuring his staff by it. But that whole KPI about lost keys was completely out of kilter with the organisation's vision of giving great customer service, or its mission. I certainly didn't feel I had great customer service on that occasion. And those little disconnects can kill your competitive advantage. So first tool to talk about that is useful for us as BAs, and in fact I almost feel a bit like a fraud for calling this a tool, because it's really just a mnemonic or an acronym, is our good old friend VMOST. Okay, VMOST stands for Vision, Mission, Objective, Strategy, Tactics. Okay, and the idea here is at the top of our organisational tree, if you like, there should be some kind of guiding vision or mission. If you want to have a good debate, not argument, no, if you want to have a good argument with BAs, ask the difference between vision and mission. My take on it, incidentally, is a mission is like a guiding core purpose, probably doesn't change very often. A vision is an envisioned future state, which you might actually get to, and it might change. And these need to be clear, concise, repeatable. They've got to talk to people. People have got to, engage with them. An organisation I'm really passionate about that I volunteer for is the International Institute for Business Analysis, IIBA. And IIBA's global core purpose is to unite a community of professionals to create better business outcomes. And that tells you a lot about what the organisation's for. You know, the fact that I'm volunteering in the UK, there are others in this room that are volunteering in different countries, we're all pitching for that same guiding focus. We've got that laser-light focus. Another organisation I have a lot of time for is the Alzheimer's Society. And the Alzheimer's Society has a vision of a world without dementia. Again, that tells you a lot about what that organisation is trying to do. You know, you aren't going to get the Alzheimer's Society doing medical research into cancer cures. That's not to say that research in cancer cure isn't a good thing. Of course it is, and there will be charities that do that. But the Alzheimer's Society is focused on dementia. So decision-making becomes easier. Everyone's pushing in that same direction. But of course, vision, mission are normally quite aspirational, quite high level, not directly executable. So our next level down are our objectives. And these need to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound, all of those good things that we know and love as BAs. And I mean, to give you an example here, in the United Kingdom, at IIBA, we have the global mission of creating better business outcomes or uniting a community of professionals. We have specific objectives around, so for example, in 2015, we're going to run 30 events. We want 1,000 members by the end of the year. We want a 75% renewal rate and 97% net promoter score. So those are our objectives for 2015. And they crystallise the group of volunteers that are pushing towards that. We all know we're pushing for the same thing. But of course, objectives in isolation don't tell you how you're going to achieve them. So they're supported by strategies, kind of broad themes. Think of them as strategic pillars. So, as an example, IIBA UK chapter, to increase our membership to 1,000, we are cooperating with complementary associations. You know, we'll speak to other associations to cross-pollinate ideas. But where the rubber really hits the road is at the tactical level. And these are the actionable, granular tasks and projects that contribute towards the strategies that enable us to hit our objectives, that mean we're on mission and propelling ourselves towards our vision. A different way to imagine this VMOST is like a rocket. And if you could suspend disbelief for a moment and imagine that does look like a rocket. I'm not very good at PowerPoint, that was the best I could do. You've got your vision and mission that's like the guiding nose cone. You've got the objectives which are supporting that. You've got like rocket fuel in your strategic themes, and you've got your thrusters and boosters that are the tactics, the actionable, executable things that we do to contribute towards the strategic themes. And of course our change portfolio sits there, the kind of projects that we're running, irrespective of whether we call them tactical or strategic or whatever, they should be aligned. And, you know, I'm sure every one of us in this organisation, in this room, who's working on a project or projects, I'm sure every single project we work on, it's strategically aligned. I'm sure we all know the complete strategic alignment, and there's that complete trace back right up to the mission, isn't there? Maybe not. No, probably not. Because, of course, what happens in reality? Well, organisations are normally divided into different departments, business units, market-facing business units, or whatever. And often what organisations do is they say, well, we're going to put a portfolio of change across all of these divisions. A portfolio of change, or as I like to call it, a leaky bucket. Because change goes in, and if we're lucky, some will get delivered, some will spill over because we haven't got enough budget, some will sort of leak out the bottom. And then there's the great question of how does change get in there? How do ideas get into that portfolio of change? Well, sometimes they probably get in there because somebody says, it's a great idea. I don't know about you, but one phrase I've learned to be very wary of, particularly on a Monday morning when someone's had time to think over the weekend, when they rock up to your desk and say, I've had an idea. And you suddenly think, yeah, next 3 years of my life are going to be on that idea. Or sometimes people might say things like, well, why wouldn't we? The no-brainer decision. Anyone worked on those, the no-brainer decisions? Presumably because there hasn't been a brain involved in making the decision. Or sometimes people say things like, well, we've already chosen a vendor. Anyone been there? Or the boss says, or our client wants, or the trump card is, and we have a business case. And now, I need to be quite clear here, I'm not arguing against business cases, they are really, really important, but I think we're all friends here, and we can probably admit that some business cases are a complete work of fiction. You know that, we know that. And so it creates this almost impetus to get the complete work of fiction in there because it's a great idea and we've chosen a vendor anyway and it's not the least bit strategic aligned, even if we call it strategic and so forth. And this is where, when I was talking about those two lenses, this is where the ivory tower comes in. Because it's like, well, you're telling us this is the strategy, but then you're telling us to do all this change which isn't aligned to it in the slightest. And the serious problem then occurs that we get this like strategic fault line. And this is where we get people in the organisation acting like the receptionist because they're being given localised messages about how to optimise a localised part of the organisation, but no one's taking that bigger picture. But it's not all doom and gloom, of course. And there's a lot we can do as BAs to help prevent these sorts of things occurring. So I'm going to talk through some techniques now. As I say, it will be a whistle-stop tour. If there's anything you want to know more about, tap me up afterwards. We can have a conversation and so forth. But when we're thinking about strategy and strategic analysis and the rest of it, keeping the nautical theme, a good first question to ask is what kind of ship are you on? Because think about it, there are different types of ship out there. We might be working on a cruise ship. I mean, I don't mean literally. I mean, if you do work on a cruise ship, then that's probably a pretty cool BA job, but I suspect probably none of us do. But if you think about what a cruise ship does, right, a cruise ship works in quite a predictable environment. It has a roster of the ports of call, it knows the precise time it's leaving, it can predict the precise time it's going to get to its destination. It knows all the stops along the way. If there are any treacherous grounds, they're charted, and you're probably not going to meet many, if any, pirates. Your external environment is pretty tame, doesn't change. And if you are in an organisation where your business environment is static, where you can predict what's going to happen in the next 3, 6, 12 months, then maybe you can plan project strategies like a cruise ship. Although increasingly, probably fewer of us are on that kind of ship. Now, this is your traditional waterfall environment. You can predict, you can know what you want months, years in advance. The contrast is like an explorer's ship. You know, if you imagine Christopher Columbus, inspiring a whole bunch of people to say, I'm going to go and find the Americas. Yeah, I know people are telling you the world is flat, but just trust me, we won't fall off the edge. Come with me. The actual destination he was getting to was unknowable. He had a hypothesis, and he was testing it. and the waters were treacherous. And in that kind of environment, navigation, the ability to pivot quickly is really important. And in situations, in a business situation, this is where our business environment is changing around us really rapidly, and we need to be even more conscious of those organizational icebergs, continually scanning our own business environment. Now, thinking about that definition of strategy, if we were to flatten it out into a diagram, because as BAs we love diagrams, well, strategy is about taking an organization from a current state towards a future state, and we define a strategy to get between those two places. But you look at that diagram and think, well, that's really interesting, because as business analysts, what we tend to do is take a current state. But of course, that current state, normally people are telling us about how horrible it is. There's a big grey cloud over it. I had to get a cloud in here, being British. We have to talk about the weather. And there's this envisioned future state, and it's sunny and great. But we talk about implementing a change. But if you think about it, that strategy at the organisational level is really met by us implementing a whole bunch of these projects to push along that strategic curve, which is why I was really pleased when BA BOK 3 came out, and it talks about this as being a change strategy, which just reinforces what we've probably all felt for a time, that business analysis is a strategic role. You know, we are defining change strategies for the projects that we work on. So I'll show you a model that kind of brings all of this together. But before I do, I am going to ask for just a little bit of audience interaction. It's nothing too hideous, don't worry. But I'm going to ask you, this picture... Oh, and the other thing to mention, of course, is we'll be navigating around our organisational icebergs, as we've mentioned. Can anyone guess where this picture was taken and who that very handsome chap at the front is? This was probably taken about 25 years ago. The people in the front row have a significant advantage. So where was that picture taken, would you? So Rochester, Minnesota. Anyone from Rochester, Minnesota in the room? Okay, we have one person, fantastic. And this very handsome chap waiting for the school bus, who do you think that might be? Yeah, me, yeah. So you probably can't hear the Minnesotan accent. It's been a while, but I spent some of my life in Minnesota. My dad worked for IBM throughout the 80s, and we were assigned out there for a while. And anyway, had a great time as a kid. And I recently had the opportunity to go back to Minnesota, to Minneapolis, to the amazing professional development day that they have there. And incidentally, if you like this event, you totally should look up the Minneapolis St. Paul's Professional Development Day. It is awesome. But when I was there, I thought, well, I kind of want to get back to Rochester because I want to see my old school. I want to see Hoover Elementary School. Is it still there? Is Apache Mall still there? And the Silver Lake Strip Mall that I remember. So I was thinking about hiring a car, because there's no easy way to get between Minneapolis and Rochester without driving. Trouble is, in the UK, we drive on the other side of the road. And we have a very different traffic signals, for example, and road signs. So I downloaded a copy of the Minnesota's driver's manual, which some of you in the audience will probably be familiar with. And if you're not, it's a fascinating read, right? The Minnesota's driver's manual tells you what to do if you accidentally drive into a lake. If you're wondering, you have to get to the back of the car because the engine will pull the car down, apparently, so who knew? Anyway, I wasn't planning to drive in any lakes, but anyway, one thing, you know, sometimes I'm a bit of a BA geek. I see business analysis everywhere, and I came across this acronym, and I thought, that's not about driving, that's about business analysis, and it's about strategy. Now, in the UK, when you learn to drive in the UK, your driving instructor bangs into you this mnemonic, which is MSM, mirror, signal, maneuver, mirror, signal, maneuver. In Minnesota, they have SIPD, okay? And SIPD stands for scan, identify, predict, decide, execute. I'm sure all the Minnesotan folk in here knew that off the top of your head. And I was looking at this and I was thinking, well, that's really curious, because if you think about strategic analysis, you scan the environment, you identify the opportunities and threats, you predict what you need to do, the benefits and opportunities, you decide on a course of action, and then you actually execute that action. And I thought, well hang on, but what goes wrong with strategy, okay? Well, sometimes organisations don't do the analysis up front. They don't do scan, identify, decide, or predict, decide. And that is as ridiculous as kind of saying, okay, well, I feel like turning right now, so I won't look. Good luck with that. But equally, some organisations get into analysis paralysis where they scan, identify, decide, but then don't execute. And that is as ridiculous as saying, okay, there's a junction coming up here, the lights are red, and they're not hitting the brake. Neither are going to end well. But organisations do this. So I throw that in for a bit of fun. It's a fun model. However, a more formal sort of strategic analysis model looks a bit like this. This is adopted, liberally repurposed from BA-BOK version 3. As BAs, of course, we analyse the current state. We define or predict the future state. We can define it if we're on a sort of cruise ship environment. If we're on a Columbus ship, if we're on an Explorer, we might need to predict it. We analyse the gap between those two states, make a recommendation. That probably feeds into some kind of business case. And throughout all of this, we'll be assessing risks. Because as BAs, we've got that like sixth sense for risks. We've got like an analysis antenna that twitches when we see those risks. So I'm going to very quickly talk about some techniques we can use at each one of these stops. And the first thing to say is it's really important that we actually know. So, thinking about these tactical projects that we're running and the strategic projects, it's really important that we ensure they're aligned to the VMOST. And this comes back to the rocket ship analogy again. And what we're saying here is, as business analysts, it's really important that we know what these things are. And some organisations don't make it very easy for you to find these things. There are organisations that are great at communicating these things, but sometimes you have to poke around on an intranet to find them. And it's really useful for us to know and find these things out. Then we can ensure there is alignment. But thinking about the first stop on that journey, assessing the current state. Well, one technique we can use, and again, calling it a technique, I almost feel like a fraud because it's another mnemonic, but is Steeple. And this is a technique that can help us analyse the external business environment that an organisation is working in. You may have heard of other similar techniques like PESTLE, PEST, STEP. They're all really fundamentally the same. Steeple stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical. If we were a taxi firm in London right now, and if we were to do a Steeple analysis, one of the things which would come into probably social and technological is this app, which is scaring London cab drivers in their droves, which is Uber. You all familiar with Uber? Yeah, it's caused a storm in Europe, and it's really disrupting the taxi environment. Now, if you're running a taxi firm, it's really important that you know Uber is out there. It might change the kind of projects that you do. You might suddenly say, we need an app, or we're deliberately not going to have an app. We're going to change the market we compete in. We're going to aim mainly at corporate clients, or we're going to do airport runs, or executive transport, or whatever. But knowing it's there is really important. Equally, knowing the economic environment. Are you in a recession? Are you in a point where people have got disposable income? Is going to affect the kind of products, projects that an organisation runs. And really what we're talking about here is, where are some of those organisational icebergs that we might inadvertently hit? Let's make sure that our projects are actually not going to veer us into one of these without us thinking about it first. Now, this will help us get a sense of our external business environment, but of course, often we'll be initiating a project or a piece of change or an initiative to respond to an opportunity or a threat, but often there's an internal problem. And a great technique for assessing an internal problem and thinking about its root cause is the humble old Fishbone Diagram, sometimes called an Ishikawa diagram, after Dr. Ishikawa that created it. You occasionally hear it called a cause and effect diagram. And what you do here is you put the problem statement, or a hypothesized problem statement to start with, on the head of a fish, and you analyze, brainstorm the contributing factors. And you look at the problem from various angles. Now, there are all sorts of angles you can look at it from, but the 4 Ps are a good start. And the 4 Ps are policies, procedures, people, and plant. So by policies, we mean higher level organisational policies that might be impacting the problem in some way. So, there's been a recruitment freeze. That means that we can't provide the customer service we need, which means we're getting lots of complaints or whatever. Procedures are about the processes and procedures. So maybe there are too many handoffs or whatever, and that's causing worse customer service or whatever. People, issues related to the people doing the jobs, maybe they've never been trained. And the 4th P is plant. In a manufacturing environment, that would be the physical plant and machinery. In our world, or many of our worlds, that's probably the technology, the IT. So maybe we're on some legacy platform that means we can't track our customers and so forth. And then we put all the contributing factors on as arrows and secondary arrows. And an example, I'm really clumsy as well, by the way. You may yet see me fall over in this presentation. We put our contributing arrows. This is an example. It's on the slide pack that you can download. But to give you a sense here, you can see that we've got a problem of 60% of customers abandon their application online and ring the call centre instead. And we've got contributing factors like, the IT is not user-friendly. That's because it's unsupported, it's legacy, but we didn't get customer input to our original requirements and so on and so forth. Can be used really neatly alongside the 5 Whys technique, for those of you that are familiar with 5 Whys. A lot more I could say about this. As I say, if you want to know more, do grab me for a coffee after. So that's useful. With our Steeple and our Fishbone Diagram, we get a sense of really where the problems are, the sort of current state. We then need to think about defining where we want to go, and a really great, a concise and precise way of doing that is with the humble old problem statement. There are many ways to write a problem statement, but an intuitive way is like this. The problem of some kind of problem is affecting some stakeholders somewhere, the impact of which is some negative impact. A successful solution would deliver some kind of positive outcome. And we focus on outcome here, not solution, outcome. And even though that's only 4 lines, the really cool thing is that we're asking really important questions. We're starting by asking that important question of what problem are we trying to solve here? Think back to the Titanic. Are we trying to solve safety, luxury, some combination of the two? By thinking about who it's affecting, we're starting to ask who our stakeholders are. Who's affected by this problem? By thinking about the impact, we're asking why should we care? There are many problems in organisations, but probably there is limited budget. So we need to focus that budget on the problems that really, really matter. And by thinking about what a successful solution looks like, we're asking what are the benefits, what are the outcomes that we are aiming for. Now that might sound a bit abstract, so I've got a worked example to just talk you through very quickly. So let's imagine now that we are working for a London-based taxi firm. And our manager, the CEO, is really worried because the taxi business is being disrupted by new channels, new business models by Uber, and he's really worried. Booking and passenger numbers are dropping. So we go into work on Monday, and the CEO comes up to us and says, right, I've been thinking about this over the weekend. I have an idea. We need an app. Has anyone worked on that project, by the way? The We Need an App project. Yeah, I'm seeing nods. And we kind of say, okay, well, you could do that, but not entirely sure how that aligns to strategy, and not entirely sure how that fits with our external business environment. So, entertain us here. Let's just do a bit of a problem statement. And we say, okay, yeah, we'll get the people around the table, we do it. So we start with this expressed solution, which is we need an app, and we delve down into it. And perhaps after a bit of debating, we discover that the problem isn't a lack of an app, the problem is increased competition from new competitors and substitutes. And we could wrangle with the wording a little bit, but that will probably give us a hypothesis for now. It's affecting our drivers and contact centre staff, the impact of which is a reduction in bookings, leading to underutilised cars and drivers. And a successful solution would protect us from competitive forces and would allow us to retain and grow our customer base. All of a sudden, we've sort of dodged that bullet. We've moved away from this assertion that we must have an app to thinking about what the problem is, what a successful outcome would look like. And you can imagine there will be different ways of solving that problem. It might be a change of market strategy or whatever. We could enhance this further with a strategic alignment statement. And a strategic alignment statement is dead simple. You just add 2 lines to a problem statement and say, this aligns with our stated strategy by, and it would help us meet our objectives of whatever. And just by adding this to the bottom of our problem statement, it gets people thinking, is this aligned? If it isn't, maybe it isn't a problem that we need to solve. So just 2 additional lines onto the problem statement can help a great deal. Even if we only did that, we are probably starting to get things on an even keel. We're starting to push in the right direction. But we can take it even further, and we can start to ask what the critical success factors and key performance indicators that are important for this particular piece of change is or are. And if you imagine taking that problem or opportunity, and this is the traditional balanced business scorecard. It's in BA-Bot version 3. It's been around a long while, though. And we could ask the question, well, what would change financially? Okay, well, maybe in our taxi example, we are aiming for increased revenues. That might be a critical success factor of solving this problem. But then we would pin a key performance indicator onto that. Okay, how much more revenue do we need? What does success look like? But also, what does it mean for our customer? Are we looking at delivering enhanced customer service? If so, how do we measure that? Are there any internal processes that we know we need to excel at? Maybe in our taxi booking situation, we need to enhance the booking experience. We need to book quicker, slicker, or whatever. Think about ways of measuring that. And finally, on the traditional balanced business scorecard, this is learning and development or innovation. I've bent that to be sustain. And what this is talking about is defining ways of measuring how we know that this opportunity will stay leveraged or that problem will stay solved. There's no point, it's an own goal if we deliver something that solves the short-term need but isn't scalable. So if we think about that, we've got measurable outcomes that we're aiming for. We might not put targets on them yet, but we know how success is going to be measured. So again, we're pushing in that right direction. Along the bottom of that diagram, that sort of model I showed you, we had assessed risks. Not a huge amount I'm going to say about this, other than to say that there are clearly different categories of risk, and there will be some that are or 2 dimensions that we probably want to look at are impact and probability, and there'll be some risks that are high impact, high probability. Those are probably the risks that we want to think about avoiding, mitigating, transferring, and so forth. And there may well be some that are in the middle that we take less evasive action for, and some down in the bottom left-hand corner that we might even ignore. But the key thing I think here as business analysts is that often we're in a really, really great, unique position to perceive those risks. And although risk management is primarily a project management task, the identification and assessment of risk is definitely somewhere where we can add value as BAs. The final stop on that model was to identify options or solution options, and of course the reality is there are hundreds of potential ways that we could change an organisation. We might look at process change. It might be that there are ways of solving the problem without touching IT at all. Reduce handoffs, make the process slicker, quicker, better. It might be that we need new facilities in a new location. There might be organisational structure changes that we recommend. Of course, it's likely that there will be some technology impact. We might have people changes, the way they're recruited, the number we need, the skills they need, the training they require. And we might even be recommending changes to the proposition, lines of business, how we're selling, and so on and so forth. Or some combination of all of those things. And often it will be a combination. If you change a process, often you have to change the technology, train the people, and so forth. So, just to recap before we close. When we've talked about that strategic analysis, we've talked about analysing the current state with Steeple, with our Fishbone Diagram. We've talked about defining or predicting the future state with our problem statement and our critical success factors and KPIs built around that balanced business scorecard. We've talked about analysing a gap and making recommendations, talked about that very briefly with a range of solutions that we might recommend, and we'll assess risks along the way. Clearly that will need to input into some kind of estimation of value or business case. In doing this, if we have that laser-like focus on the vision, the mission, the objective and the strategy of the organisation, then what will ensure is that the projects and programmes that we work on are aligned to the organisation's strategy, will help our managers, our execs, our VPs, our presidents avoid those organisational icebergs. One final ponder point to leave you with before we all go and enjoy some coffee. This is the actual text of the final telegram that was sent to the Titanic, the one that the radio operator responded, shut up, you're jamming me." It gives the specific latitude and longitude of the ice field. But how many of us in organisations have tried to get messages through that have been ignored, that have meant that our organisations have perhaps been exposed to risks that they weren't aware of? And with additional focus on strategic analysis, as a community of business analysts, how might we help our organisations to avoid that? And with that, I will thank you for listening. So we have about 5 minutes, so if anyone has a quick question before coffee. Otherwise, do connect with me on Twitter. By the way, people describe me as a prolific blogger. I'm never sure whether that's a compliment, although I do take it as one. Do check out my blog and subscribe. I'm around today and tomorrow, so do grab me if you've got questions. So go enjoy some coffee.